I've been to a lot of weddings in my 65 years, but I'd never imagined I'd leave one feeling smaller than the man I was when I walked in. It wasn't just any wedding either, it was my own son's. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The ballroom by Lake Michigan gleamed like a scene out of a magazine. Chandeliers spilled light over white linens and gold-rimmed plates. Waiters floated by with champagne, and the band tuned up something soft and polished. Everyone looked expensive, and for a moment I thought maybe Daniel had done well. Maybe all the nights I spent sanding wood until my hands bled had led to this. My boy living the kind of life his mother once dreamed for him. Then I caught a glimpse of myself in one of those mirrors along the wall. The suit I wore was older than the groom, a brown wool thing Margaret had hemmed by hand before she passed. I tried smoothing the sleeves, but the fabric still carried the smell of sawdust. Around me, women in silk whispered behind tall glasses, their laughter light and sharp. I smiled anyway, because that's what fathers do. When Daniel walked in with his bride, Olivia, the room rose to its feet. He looked every bit the city man, now new haircut, sharp tuxedo, the kind of confidence that comes from forgetting where you started. He hugged a few of his co-workers, waved to some faces I didn't know, then glanced at me for the briefest second. It wasn't warmth I saw there. It was calculation, like he was deciding whether acknowledging me would cost him something. Dinner came and went. Toasts began. Olivia's father spoke first, all charm and easy humor. Then the best man took the microphone, talking about ambition, success, and making your own name. People clapped, and the music dimmed again. I thought that was the end of it until Daniel stood up, holding his glass high. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You know," he said, his voice carrying over the sound system, "I've always hated being a Grant. That name smells like sawdust and sweat." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then laughter rippled through the tables like a wave, nervous at first, then loud and full. Some guests looked toward me as if checking whether it was all in good fun. I lifted my glass, pretending my throat hadn't gone dry. Inside, something cracked. I'd spent 40 years carving cabinets and staircases across this city. Every screw and joint, every scar on my palms, had paid for his education, his car, that tuxedo he was wearing. But standing there, watching him soak in their laughter, I felt like the dirt he'd brushed off his shoes before walking into that ballroom. I thought about Margaret then. She used to say, "Tom, you can tell what kind of man a boy will become by how he talks about his family." If she'd been there that night, her heart would have broken twice, once for him, once for me. The rest of the evening blurred. People kept drinking. The band played something fast. Olivia smiled too hard, her eyes darting toward me more than once. I couldn't stay. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket, feeling the thin envelope. I'd brought a check I couldn't really afford, and a photo of Margaret and me holding Daniel when he was born. I left both on the table before I walked out. Outside, the autumn air bit through the wool of my suit. The lake wind carried a chill that smelled of iron and salt. Behind me, the music swelled again, and the laughter rose like a tide. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glow spilling from the windows, then turned toward the parking lot. Every step away from that ballroom felt heavier, but cleaner somehow, like I was leaving not just a wedding, but a version of myself that had believed love alone could hold a family together. The parking lot was quiet, except for the sound of wind scraping across the asphalt. My old pickup sat under a flickering street lamp, the same one I'd driven for 20 years. Its paint had faded, and the passenger seat still held the dent where Margaret used to sit. I rested my hand on the cold metal before climbing in, as if she might still be there beside me. When I turned the key, the engine coughed twice before starting. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing my reflection in the windshield, an old man with red eyes and a tie slightly askew. For the first time that night, I let myself exhale. The laughter from the ballroom echoed faintly through the glass, like ghosts that didn't know when to stop dancing. I drove without thinking, following the lakefront road out of downtown. The city lights gave way to empty warehouses, then to quiet streets where the trees arched over the pavement like tired shoulders. My phone buzzed once in the cup holder. Daniel's name lit up on the screen. I stared at it until it went dark again. There were no words left that wouldn't turn to dust. By the time I reached the south side, the night had deepened. I parked in front of my shop, Grant and Son Carpentry, though the and Son part had started to feel like a lie. The sign creaked softly in the wind. I left the engine running for a moment, listening to it rumble like an old heart that refused to stop. Inside, the air smelled of pine and varnish. My tools hung neatly on the wall, each in its place. The workbench was covered with wood shavings, the kind Margaret used to sweep away every Saturday morning. On the shelf sat a small jar of nails she'd labeled with her careful handwriting. For Tom's projects. I ran my thumb over the faded ink. I sat down on the stool and opened the small radio I kept by the window. A country song drifted through the static, something about fathers and sons and the miles between them. I turned it low, not wanting to drown out my thoughts. It's strange how humiliation doesn't always burn right away. Sometimes it seeps in slow, like cold water through your boots. Sitting there, I replayed Daniel's words over and over, each one carving a deeper line inside me. That name smells like sawdust and sweat. He wasn't wrong about the smell. My life had been built on it, but I'd never thought I should be ashamed of it. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded photo from the wedding, the one I'd left behind, then changed my mind and took back when no one was looking. Margaret was smiling in it, sunlight catching in her hair, Daniel barely a year old in her arms. She'd been gone 8 years, yet somehow her voice still lingered in that shop. Don't let pride be the thing that keeps you from love, Tom. I wondered what she'd tell me now. Would she have urged me to forgive him? To call him? To make peace? Or would she have seen what I saw, that sometimes the only way to teach someone the worth of love is to let them feel its absence? A draft slipped through the window frame. I rubbed my palms together, the skin rough and cracked, still carrying the smell of varnish. Outside, a freight train passed somewhere in the distance, its horn long and lonely. I thought about going upstairs to bed, but the night felt too heavy for sleep. So I reached for a fresh piece of oak and began sanding, the way I always did when my mind needed order. The sound of sandpaper against wood was steady, rhythmic like breathing. The grain of the oak caught the light, smooth and golden, and for a moment I felt grounded again. That was when I noticed the small tear in the corner of the photograph, the one that showed Daniel's baby hand gripping my thumb. I placed it on the bench and smoothed it flat. My chest ached, not from anger, but from something older, something like grief, mixed with resolve. I looked around the shop, at every cabinet, every doorframe I'd ever made. My name was carved into all of them, quiet but permanent. Maybe Daniel could run from it, bury it under fancy suits and new friends. But that name, our name, wasn't going anywhere. By the time the sun began to edge through the blinds, I had made a decision. I didn't know exactly what kind of justice life had in store, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done being a Grant. Not yet. My workshop sat behind a narrow brick house on the south side. It wasn't much to look at, but it had everything I needed. A stove that still worked when it felt like it, a pot of coffee that never really went cold, and a radio that could find a country station, if I turned the dial just right. The air inside always smelled of pine and varnish, the same scent that had followed me for 40 years. Some people might have called it loneliness, but to me it was home. Every morning, I followed the same ritual. I'd unlock the shop, set the coffee pot on the counter, and open the blinds to let in what light the Chicago sky decided to spare that day. Then I'd start working small orders, mostly shelves, window frames, the occasional table. Folks still came to me because they said I worked slow, and in this city, slow was starting to feel like a compliment. I kept everything just the way Margaret had left it. Her apron still hung by the back door, faded to a softer blue now. The jar of buttons she'd collected over the years sat by the window, catching sunlight like tiny coins. Sometimes I'd talk to her as I worked, just to hear a voice in the room. "You'd laugh at me, Maggie," I said one morning, wiping sawdust from my hands. A 65-year-old man talking to himself like the walls care. Ben usually showed up around mid-morning. He was my neighbor for nearly 3 decades, a retired Marine with a limp and a habit of bringing over the day's gossip with 2 cups of diner coffee. That morning, I heard his boots crunch the gravel outside before he pushed the door open. "You look like hell, Tom," he said, handing me a cup. "I saw your boy's name in the paper. Wedding announcement, big picture and all. Must have been some fancy deal." I took the cup and nodded. Yeah, fancy enough to forget his old man. Ben leaned against the doorframe, studying me the way men do when they're trying to decide if they should talk sense or just listen. Kids these days care more about what folks think than what they are. But don't let that name of yours fade. You hear me? Don't let the boy erase it. I gave a small smile. You make it sound like a war, Ben. He shrugged. Sometimes it is. You fight it with patience instead of bullets. He stayed a while, telling stories about the old neighborhood, about the diner that changed owners again, about the church's bingo night raising money for the roof. Normal things, familiar things. I didn't realize how much I needed that kind of talk until after he left, and the quiet came rushing back in. That afternoon, I sat by the window with another cup of coffee gone lukewarm. The autumn wind rattled the glass, carrying the smell of wet leaves and smoke. Across the street, a kid in a hoodie was raking his front yard, headphones in, moving to music only he could hear. For a moment, I envied that kind of freedom, the way youth lets you forget what time feels like. The mail arrived late, as it usually did. I shuffled through the stack. A utility bill, a flyer for some home insurance, a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs that wasn't even mine. And then, at the bottom, an envelope heavier than the rest. It was cream-colored, with a neat printed label, Harrison and Whitaker Law Group, Boston, Massachusetts. Boston. I hadn't been there since I was a boy. My father had an older brother who moved east after the war, but we'd lost touch long ago. I stared at the envelope, feeling the paper's weight between my fingers. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I set it on the kitchen table beside Margaret's old recipe box and tried to ignore it, the way you ignore a knock at the door when you're not ready for company. But it sat there, quiet and patient, like it knew I'd come around eventually. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the clock tick on the dresser. Every sound in the house seemed louder than usual, the pipes groaning, the wind sneaking under the door, the low hum of the fridge. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, then stopped. I turned over and stared at the ceiling. I kept seeing Daniel's face under those chandeliers, the laughter that followed his words, the way he didn't even flinch when I walked out. I'd told myself I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. But lying there in the dark, I realized that wasn't true. The anger hadn't faded. It had just changed shape, settling deeper, turning into something quieter, heavier, something that wanted purpose. I got up, pulled on my old flannel shirt, and went back to the workshop. The envelope still waited on the table. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The paper caught the light from the street lamp, and for a moment, I thought I saw my father's handwriting in the return address, though it was just printed letters. Strange how memory plays tricks when you're tired. I laid it back down without opening it. "Not tonight," I murmured. "Not yet." "Don't act." Then I went to the bench, picked up a piece of walnut wood, and started carving. Each stroke of the chisel echoed through the room, measured and steady. The rhythm calmed me more than sleep ever could. And when I finally stopped, the outline of a small frame had appeared, a place to put a photograph. I knew which one it would hold. They say the city never sleeps, but Daniel did restlessly, beneath silk sheets and quiet guilt. From 20 stories above Madison Avenue, the skyline stretched like a promise he'd almost kept. Every morning he woke to the hum of traffic below, the gleam of glass towers, the illusion that he had finally escaped the smell of sawdust and sweat. He was Daniel Carter now. Not Grant, never Grant. The name change had been simple enough. One signature, one quiet visit to the courthouse. He'd told Olivia it was for branding, something about sounding more professional for his work in public relations. She hadn't questioned it then. She'd been too busy planning the wedding, dazzled by his confidence and that expensive apartment they couldn't quite afford. At the firm, everyone admired him. Daniel had the right suit, the right watch, the right smile that said he belonged in the room. But the truth was, every compliment felt like a lie he had to keep feeding. His colleagues saw him as the kind of man who'd grown up vacationing in Cape Cod, not someone who'd once eaten peanut butter sandwiches in a Chicago workshop. He kept two worlds separate, the one he sold to others, and the one he'd buried under layers of polished charm. Even his office reflected it. Framed magazine covers, a decanter of bourbon he barely drank, and not a single photo of family. Just a wall of glass and ambition. Sometimes, though, he'd catch the faintest whiff of wood polish from the furniture and freeze. It was a scent that belonged to another life, his father's life, and he'd feel something twist inside his chest. He'd turn away quickly, open the window, let the city drown it out. Olivia began noticing the cracks first. She wasn't a fool. She was raised in Ohio, where people still looked each other in the eye when they talked. She had married Daniel because he seemed so sure of who he was. But lately, his confidence felt rehearsed. He laughed too quickly, corrected her when she mentioned Chicago in front of others, changed the subject whenever family came up. One night, while they were having dinner with his colleagues, someone asked casually, "So, Daniel, what did your dad do?" There was a pause just long enough for her to notice. He smiled, lifted his wine glass, and said smoothly, "He was an engineer. Passed away when I was a kid." The table murmured their sympathies. Olivia said nothing. But later that night, lying beside him, she stared at the ceiling and thought about how easy that lie had rolled off his tongue. She wanted to ask, but something in his tone had warned her not to. Days turned into weeks. Daniel buried himself in work, chasing clients and applause. Olivia filled the empty apartment with flowers, trying to bring warmth into a home that never quite felt alive. He'd leave before dawn, return long after dark, smelling faintly of cologne and exhaustion. When she'd ask how his day went, he'd say, "Fine," in that clipped way that meant, "Don't ask again." The distance grew like ivy on a wall, slow, quiet, inevitable. One rainy afternoon, Olivia decided to reorganize the hallway closet. She was searching for an umbrella when her hand brushed against a cardboard box tucked behind a stack of gift bags. Inside were papers, old certificates, bills, a few wedding cards. She smiled at first, thinking it was just clutter Daniel had forgotten to toss. But then she saw it, an envelope from the hotel where they'd held their wedding reception. Her breath caught when she pulled out the invitation, still inside. The name printed in gold foil stopped her cold. Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Grant. Not Carter, Grant. She read it again, her fingers trembling slightly. Beneath the shine of the embossed letters, the truth flickered small, sharp, undeniable. Grant. She sat on the floor, the paper resting on her knees. Outside, rain streaked down the windows like tears on glass. A thought she'd been ignoring for months suddenly took shape. Who are you really, Daniel? That evening, he came home late, rain on his shoulders, his tie loosened. She'd left the invitation on the kitchen counter, beside his keys. He noticed it immediately. "Where did you find that?" His voice was calm, but the edge was there. "In the closet," she said quietly. "Under the gift bags." He stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it once, twice, until it disappeared into his palm. "It's nothing," he said. "Just an old mistake. I meant to throw it out." "Your real last name is Grant?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Because it doesn't matter. That name doesn't mean anything anymore. I have some note of significance to you, maybe," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But it's part of who you are." He met her eyes, and for a second, the mask slipped. Something raw flickered there, shame, maybe fear. "You don't understand. You didn't grow up the way I did. You don't know what it's like to have people look at you and see nothing but a pair of dirty hands and an old flannel shirt." Olivia hesitated. "Your father Thomas, he's still alive, isn't he?" The question landed like a stone. Daniel turned away, grabbing a towel to dry his hair. "I don't want to talk about him." But the silence that followed said everything. That night, Olivia lay awake, listening to the city outside the sirens, the honking, the endless hum. Beside her, Daniel's breathing was shallow, uneven. She turned to face him, studying the man she thought she knew. Somewhere between ambition and fear, he had built himself a cage. When he finally drifted into sleep, she slipped out of bed and padded softly into the living room. The glow from the streetlights fell across the counter where her laptop sat. She hesitated, then opened it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed, "Thomas Grant, Chicago, carpenter." The search results began to load. The search results loaded slowly, as if even the internet hesitated to dig into the truth. Olivia scrolled down, her heart thudding with every line that mentioned the name Thomas Grant. There were a few listings, local directories, a Yelp review for Grant and Son Carpentry, and an old newspaper article about community volunteers helping repair a church roof on the south side of Chicago. She clicked on the article. A grainy photo appeared, an older man standing beside a ladder, smiling modestly at the camera. The caption read, "Thomas Grant, local carpenter, volunteers his time to restore historic Street Luke's Chapel." Olivia leaned closer to the screen. The man's eyes were gentle but tired, his smile shy, the kind that came from habit rather than pride. There was no mistaking it. She had seen that same jawline in her husband. The resemblance was undeniable. She closed the laptop slowly, her throat tightening. The truth wasn't tragic, it was simple, human, and unbearably honest. Daniel hadn't just changed his name. He had amputated part of himself. The next morning, she made him breakfast. Eggs, toast, black coffee, his usual. He sat at the counter, flipping through emails on his phone, barely looking up. "You were up late last night," he said without real interest. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. "I was thinking about your father." He froze, thumb hovering above the screen. "What about him?" "I found him," she said softly. "He's still in Chicago, running the old workshop." Daniel's phone screen went dark. He looked at her, eyes hardening. "You shouldn't have done that." "I just wanted to understand," she said. "You've built this whole life on a lie, Daniel. Why?" He pushed the plate away, appetite gone. "Because the truth never got me anywhere. You think people in this city care about honesty? They care about image, about names that open doors. Grant doesn't open anything, it slams them shut." She studied him for a moment. "So you'd rather live behind a door that isn't yours?" He let out a low, humorless laugh. "You don't get it. You married Daniel Carter, not some carpenter's kid who couldn't afford a college tuition without scholarships and pity." Olivia's voice trembled, but not from fear. "I married a man, not a brand. But lately, I'm not sure which one is real." He stood up, pacing the kitchen. "Do you think it was easy? Watching people look down on my father, hearing them whisper about his honest work like it was a disease? I wanted to be more than that. I had to be." "And what about him?" she asked. "What happens to a father when his son decides he's not good enough to exist?" Daniel's face tightened. "You don't know what he's like." "Then tell me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, he didn't have much to say. His memories of Thomas were a blur of wood dust, long hours, and the low hum of an old radio. His father hadn't been cruel, just quiet, old-fashioned, stubborn. The kind of man who believed that hard work could fix anything, even a son who didn't want to follow in his footsteps. "He never understood me," Daniel muttered. "He thought life was about endurance. I wanted more." "More of what?" Olivia asked. "Money? Approval from strangers? You've got that now, and you're miserable." "It's about a word." He turned toward her, anger flashing behind his eyes. "You think you're better than me because you looked up his name on Google? You don't know what it's like to claw your way up from nothing." "I don't," she admitted quietly. "But I know what it's like to build a life on truth, and I know what it looks like when someone's drowning in lies." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension sharper than glass. For a moment, Daniel looked like a boy again, lost, cornered, ashamed. Then he turned away, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. The door slammed, and the echo lingered. Olivia stood there for a long while, staring at the half-eaten breakfast. The eggs had gone cold, the coffee untouched. She felt both sorry for him and deeply afraid of what he was becoming. That evening, Daniel didn't come home. She tried calling, but each ring ended in silence. Around midnight, she found him asleep on the couch when she returned from checking the building lobby. He smelled like whiskey and rain. His tie was missing, his shirt wrinkled, his phone still glowing faintly beside him. Olivia sat on the armchair, watching him. In the dim light, he looked almost peaceful until his lips moved, muttering something she could barely hear. "I'm not him. I'm not like him." Her chest ached. She didn't know whether to wake him or let him sleep in that uneasy denial. When morning came, she found him already dressed for work, tie straight, face unreadable. The silence between them felt heavier than words. At the door, he paused. "Don't look him up again," he said quietly. "Please." Olivia didn't answer. She only watched him leave, the sound of the elevator swallowing him whole. Later that day, While cleaning the counter, she noticed the invitation from their wedding was gone. Only a faint outline of dust marked where it used to lie. That night, she sat by the window, staring at the Manhattan skyline, so bright, so hollow. Somewhere below, sirens wailed, drowning out her thoughts. She opened her laptop again, staring at the search bar still showing Thomas Grant, Chicago carpenter. Sunday mornings in Chicago had their own kind of silence. Not the empty, city after midnight sort of quiet, but the kind that hums softly beneath the world, the sound of someone flipping pancakes 3 houses down, of a church bell calling the faithful, of leaves rustling against a porch railing that hadn't been painted in years. That was the kind of morning I woke to when the letter came. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, the sort of paper that didn't belong in a carpenter's mailbox. It had my name written in dark blue ink, Mr. Thomas Grant, in the kind of handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone with soft hands. The return address said Boston, Massachusetts. I didn't know anyone in Boston. I set it on the kitchen table beside my mug of coffee, watching the steam rise. My hands hovered over it for a long while, the way a man's hands do when he's afraid of what might come out of an unopened box. For a moment, I thought about tossing it straight into the trash. The world doesn't send good news to men like me. But something about the weight of the envelope, its quiet insistence, made me reach for my pocket knife and slit it open. Inside was a folded letter and another smaller envelope embossed with a gold seal. I unfolded the first page. Dear Mr. Grant, it began, I represent the estate of Mr. Edward Grant, late of Boston, Massachusetts. You are the sole surviving heir to his estate, valued at approximately $15 million. My coffee went cold before I could read the rest. 15 million. I reread the number, tracing the letters as though they might rearrange themselves into something more believable. The late Mr. Grant was your father's elder brother. According to his final will and testament, his entire estate, consisting of liquid assets, properties, and a philanthropic trust, is to be transferred to you on the single condition that the heir must bear the name Grant with pride and honor. I stared at that last sentence so long that the words started to blur. Bear the name with pride and honor. The same name my son had disowned, the same one he mocked in front of 100 people. My throat tightened, and I folded the letter slowly, laying it on the table like a fragile relic. I pushed my chair back and walked to the window. Outside, the maple tree in the yard had begun to shed its leaves. They tumbled across the driveway in messy circles, catching the sunlight. Margaret would have loved that sight. She used to say fall was God's way of letting us watch beauty fade gracefully. I could almost hear her voice in that room, soft, teasing, reminding me to keep faith even when the world seemed cruel. $15 million, I whispered, almost laughing. Maggie, you hearing this? If she'd been alive, she'd have shaken her head and told me not to make a fool of myself believing in fairy tales. And yet, something in me stirred. Not greed, no. I'd never known that feeling, but something deeper. A sense that maybe, after all these years, the world had finally noticed the family name my son had been so eager to erase. I sat down again and read every word carefully, this time slower. The letter was official, signed by a Boston law firm, embossed with seals and stamps that looked too proper to be fake. There was a contact number, even a list of documents they requested from me, birth certificates, proof of identity, a simple affirmation that I was, in fact, Thomas Grant, son of Samuel Grant. That name. My father's name. A man I barely remembered, quiet, strong, but gone too soon. I'd spent a lifetime carrying that name through splinters, through winters that cracked my hands open, through decades of being the guy who fixes broken stairs. And now, here it was being called honorable. It felt wrong and right at the same time. I reached for the smaller envelope and found a single handwritten note on thick stationery. To Thomas, if this letter finds you, it means I'm gone. Our family has been many things proud, poor, stubborn but never faithless. You may not know me, but I know what it means to work with your hands. I've followed your life quietly, and I've seen what you built with so little. Keep our name alive, not by the money, but by the way you carry it. Edward Grant. My eyes burned before I even realized I was crying. I didn't know this man, this uncle from another life, but in those few lines, I felt as if he'd reached across generations to pat me on the shoulder, to remind me that I wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I took a long breath, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, and whispered to the empty room, "Thank you, Edward. You didn't have to, but thank you." And oaken talent. Then I laughed, softly at first, then harder until my shoulders shook. It was ridiculous. Really a carpenter in a flannel shirt sitting at a table covered in sawdust, suddenly worth more than the fancy suits that once sneered at him. When I finally caught my breath, I poured another cup of coffee, stronger this time. My hands still trembled, but not from disbelief, no, from something that felt almost holy. I looked at the photo of Margaret on the wall, her smile frozen in that gentle, knowing way. "Looks like the world hasn't forgotten us after all," I said. "Guess the Grants still have some fight left in them." But even as I said it, I knew I couldn't tell Daniel. Not yet. Money like that, it could twist a man's heart, turn shame into greed and greed into poison. My son needed to learn what pride truly meant before he could ever inherit something built on it. So I decided to keep it secret. Let fate play its quiet game. Let him prove, or fail to prove, that he was still one of us. I pulled out my old pocket notebook, the one I used to jot down woodworking measurements, and turned to a blank page. In careful handwriting I wrote, "Legacy isn't money, it's what you do with it." Then I closed the notebook, slid the letter underneath it, and sat back as the sunlight poured through the window. That night, the letter wouldn't let me rest. It sat on the table under the dim kitchen light like a quiet stranger, patient and heavy with meaning. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those words again bear the name with pride and honor. I got up around midnight, unable to sleep, and poured myself another cup of coffee. The house creaked like it was listening. Outside, the street light flickered over the frost, forming on the porch steps. I pulled Margaret's old shawl over my shoulders and sat by the window. I kept thinking about my uncle, Edward Grant. I barely remembered hearing his name. My father used to mention him only once in a while. "Your uncle went east, chasing opportunity." That was it. No letters, no visits, nothing. Yet somehow, that man had followed my life, known my name, and chosen me. Why me? I wasn't rich, wasn't educated beyond high school. I didn't build a company, or write books, or appear on television like the men my son called role models. I just built tables, repaired porches, tried to live without owing anyone a thing. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Edward saw something in that, the kind of quiet dignity that doesn't make headlines. I went to my workshop. The air was cold, sharp, with the scent of oak and varnish. I flipped the light switch and watched the room come alive in amber glow. My tools hung in their usual order, each one worn smooth from decades of use. On the workbench sat the picture frame I'd carved the night before, unfinished, waiting for a photograph. I picked it up and ran my thumb along the edge, thinking of which picture should go inside. It wasn't hard to choose. I opened the drawer where I kept the old family album. The pages were yellowed, the plastic covers curling from age. There, between photos of Daniel as a boy and one of me and Margaret on our wedding day, was an old black-and-white image of my father, Samuel Grant, standing beside a half-built barn. His sleeves were rolled up, arms strong, face tired but proud. That was the photo I placed into the frame. I set it on the shelf above the workbench, beneath the wooden sign that still read Grant and Son Carpentry. The letters had faded over time, but they were still there, stubborn, like me. I spoke softly to the photograph. "Looks like the name still means something, Pop, even after all these years." The next morning, I took a bus downtown. The ride was long and quiet, filled with the faint chatter of strangers and the smell of wet coats. I got off near the old post office and walked into the bank next door. The clerk looked up from her computer. "How can I help you, sir?" "I need to make a few certified copies," I said, placing the letter on the counter. She scanned it politely, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the embossed seal. "Congratulations, Mr. Grant," she said. "That's quite something." I nodded. "It's unexpected." Afterward, I stopped by the church. Father O'Malley was in the garden, pruning the last of the roses. He smiled when he saw me. "Thomas, you look like a man carrying a secret." "Maybe I am," I said, "but a good one, for once." He chuckled. "Well, those are rare. Care to share it?" I hesitated. Not yet. Let's just say, life's reminding me that decency doesn't go unnoticed forever. He patted my shoulder. It never does. The Lord keeps better records than we do. On the walk home, I stopped by the community diner, the one where Ben and I sometimes ate on Fridays. The waitress, Marlene, refilled my coffee and asked how things were. I just smiled and said, "Things are changing." "Good change?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "I think so. The kind that sneaks up on you after a long, hard winter. Effer is see no redos," she laughed. "Then spring must be coming early this year." When I returned home, I placed all the documents back in the drawer under my workbench. I didn't lock them. I just covered them with a folded towel, like something sacred but simple. All day, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. How he'd sneered at the name Grant like it was dirt under his expensive shoes. How he'd laughed, pretending to be someone else. A part of me wanted to call him to tell him everything. To see his face when he realized that the name he despised carried a legacy bigger than his entire New York salary. But I didn't, because that would have been revenge, not redemption. And I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted him to understand. That night, I sat by the window again, the notebook open in front of me. I wrote a few more words beneath what I'd written the day before. If a man forgets where he comes from, even fortune won't bring him home. I looked at the sentence for a while, then closed the book and exhaled. For the first time, I didn't feel like a poor man pretending to be content. I felt like a guardian of something old, quiet, and enduring. When I finally turned off the lights, I glanced once more at the letter, resting under the towel. The last thing I thought before sleep claimed me was that strange, comforting phrase, "Bear the name with pride and honor." Chicago had that kind of sky that looked like brushed steel, cold, stubborn, and unyielding. I was in the shop, sanding down the edge of a cedar bench for a neighbor's porch, when I heard the bell above the door ring. It was rare for anyone to visit without calling first. Most of my customers these days were old friends, or folks who found me through word of mouth. When I looked up, she was standing there, small frame, neat coat, eyes red like someone who hadn't slept right in days. I didn't know her face, but there was something familiar in the way she held herself, graceful, yet guarded. The kind of poise you learn when life teaches you to stay polite, even when your heart is breaking. "Mr. Grant?" she asked, her voice careful, like she wasn't sure if she had the right man. "That's me," I said, setting the sandpaper aside. "What can I do for you, miss?" She hesitated, eyes scanning the shop, the wooden shelves, the smell of oil and sawdust, the photo of Margaret on the wall. She looked out of place in that world, like porcelain in a cabinet full of tools. Finally, she said, "My name is Olivia Carter." The name hit me harder than I expected. Carter. It rolled in the air, foreign, deliberate. I wiped my hands on my apron, feeling the weight of what that meant. "You're Daniel's wife," I said slowly. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "Yes, or at least I thought I was married to him." I didn't answer right away. My instinct told me to stay calm. People only come that far when they're either lost or desperate. I motioned toward the small table near the window. "You can sit if you'd like. Coffee's not fresh, but it's warm." She smiled faintly. "Thank you." Her hands trembled a little as she wrapped them around the mug I poured. For a while, neither of us spoke. The radio played low in the corner, some old country tune about heartbreak and home. It fit too well to be background noise. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked slightly. "He never told me about this place. About you." I let out a quiet breath. "Doesn't surprise me much. He's worked hard to forget where he came from." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I know. That's why I'm here." There was a silence then, heavy, but not awkward. The kind that fills a room when two people realize they've been wounded by the same hand. She glanced toward the workbench, at the photo of me and Margaret on our wedding day, the edges yellowed with time. "She looks kind," Olivia said softly. "She was," I replied, "the kindest person I ever knew. She believed Daniel would grow up to be a good man. I used to believe that too." Her shoulders dropped a little, and she nodded, as if those words confirmed what she already feared. "He's lost himself, Mr. Grant. Completely." I didn't say anything. I'd learned long ago that silence can speak louder than any sermon. She took another sip of coffee, steadying herself. I found out who you were by accident. He told everyone, including me, that his father was an engineer who passed away years ago. He even changed his last name before our wedding. She paused, swallowing hard. I thought it was just modern. You know, people changing names for their careers. But then I found the invitation from your son's wedding, the one that said Daniel Grant. Her voice trembled. That's when I realized he'd built a life out of lies. I leaned back, letting her words settle between us like dust. I'd waited years for Daniel to face the truth, but hearing it from her was different. It was no longer about pride, it was about the wreckage my son had created in someone else's heart. You didn't come all the way from New York just to tell me that, I said gently. She shook her head. No. I came because I didn't know where else to go. I thought maybe you'd understand what it's like to love someone who's ashamed of you. That cut deeper than I expected. I felt my jaw tighten, and for a second, I couldn't find my voice. Finally, I said, yeah, I know exactly what that's like. The shop went quiet again. Outside, the wind howled down the alley, carrying bits of dry leaves against the door. Inside, the smell of wood and coffee mingled with the weight of things neither of us wanted to say out loud. Olivia wiped at her cheeks. I'm sorry to come here like this. I thought maybe you'd want to know. Or maybe I just needed to see the man he's been running from. Well, I said, offering a small, tired smile. Now you have. She nodded, her eyes scanning the room again. He told me once that carpentry was a dying trade, that it was no life for a man who wanted more. But standing here, I don't think that's true. This place feels alive, honest. I chuckled softly. It's not much, but it's real. That's more than I can say for most things these days. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't last long. I wish he could see that. I looked down at my hands, scarred, rough, lined with years of work. He saw it once, I said. When he was a boy, he used to sit right there on that stool, playing with scraps of wood while I worked. Said he wanted to build something one day. Guess he did. Just not the kind of thing you can be proud of. She swallowed hard. I married a man I don't even know. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. The kind that comes when love turns into something fragile and uncertain. I met her eyes. Then maybe you should remind him who he is. Her gaze lifted toward me, searching. And if he doesn't want to remember, then he'll have to live with what he's forgotten. That 9, her breath caught, and for a moment she looked like she might cry again. But instead, she nodded slowly, as if the truth had landed where it needed to. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and steady. I stood, walked over to the shelf, and picked up a small wooden carving, a simple bird, wings spread mid-flight. I handed it to her. Take this, I said. Made it years ago. Margaret used to say birds always find their way home. Maybe it'll remind you that not everyone stays lost forever. Olivia took it with both hands, holding it like something precious. Her eyes glistened. Thank you, Mr. Grant. I think she was right. For a while after she left, I just stood there, staring at the closed door. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the smell of her perfume, something faint, like lilies, still lingered in the air. It mixed strangely with the scent of sawdust and coffee, two smells that had followed me all my life. It wasn't until the sound of a passing train shook the glass that I realized I was still holding the coffee pot in my hand, the one I'd poured for her. I set it down, sat at the workbench, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Olivia Grant, whether she knew it or not, had walked into my life like a storm that didn't bring destruction, but clarity. She was the first person in years to speak of Daniel with honesty, the first to see the truth behind his charm, and the first to hurt for him the way I once had. I thought about her words, the way her voice broke when she said she'd married a man she didn't know. That kind of confession doesn't come from anger. It comes from heartbreak, the quiet kind that settles into your bones. I looked over at the carving bench and saw the wooden bird I'd given her twin 2 years ago. Margaret had loved those little things. She said they reminded her that no one really owns freedom, you just hope it visits sometimes. That night I took out my notebook again, the one with my small scrawled notes about work and life. I turned to the page after the last line I'd written, the one about forgetting where you come from, and added, "Sometimes it takes a stranger to bring your own blood home." I stared at that sentence for a long while, feeling its truth weigh heavy on me. The next morning, I went about my day like usual. I fixed a broken chair leg for Mrs. Patterson down the street, helped Ben haul his garbage cans after the wind knocked them over, and stopped by the diner for a slice of pie. But all the while, I kept thinking about Olivia, about how she had driven all that way just to look me in the eye and tell me that my son had become a stranger to himself. There was something brave about that. Not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet courage of someone who'd finally had enough of pretending. In the afternoon, I was back in the workshop when I noticed something on the workbench. It was a small note, folded once. For a second, I thought I'd dropped one of my order forms, but when I opened it, I saw her handwriting, elegant, deliberate. She must have left it before she drove away. "Mr. Grant," it read, "thank you for today. I don't know what Daniel will do next, but hearing you speak made me realize that strength isn't about running from the past. It's about facing it with open hands. I hope, someday, he'll find the courage to walk back through that door. And if he does, I promise he won't walk alone." She'd signed it simply, Olivia. I folded the note carefully and tucked it inside the same notebook that now held every word of this strange new chapter in my life. Later that evening, Ben came by, carrying 2 bottles of cheap beer. He took one look at me and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," I said quietly. "Maybe an echo." He chuckled. "You and your riddles. You talk to the dead or something?" I smiled faintly. "No, just someone who remembers the living." Ben didn't push. He never did. He just cracked open his bottle, took a long drink, and looked around the workshop. "You ever think of calling your boy?" "I think about it every day," I said. "But thinking and doing, they're not the same thing." He nodded, the lines on his face deepening. "Yeah, pride's a heavy coat. Keeps you warm, but it's hard to take off. This is not romantic nine." I looked down at my hands, the beer sweating cold between them. "It's not pride anymore, Ben. It's waiting. I just want him to come back as the man his mother believed he could be, not the one who left." Ben took another sip, then tapped the rim of his bottle against mine. "Then keep the porch light on, Tom. Folks find their way home easier that way." After he left, I went out to the porch. The sky had cleared, and the air smelled faintly of rain. I turned on the old light bulb hanging above the steps, the one Margaret had always called her lighthouse. Its glow was soft, barely enough to reach the driveway, but steady. I stood there for a long while, thinking about Daniel in his high-rise apartment, surrounded by glass and noise, and nothing real. Maybe Olivia was right. Maybe he was too far gone. Or maybe, like every stubborn man in our family, he just needed time to circle back. I used to think the city would never turn its back on me, that the pulse of New York, the sirens, the late-night horns, the light spilling out from office windows was the sound of success. My success. But lately, that sound had started to feel different. Colder, sharper, like a reminder that this city doesn't keep anyone warm for long. That morning, I walked into the office like I always did, suit pressed, smile rehearsed, confidence perfectly measured. My nameplate read Daniel Carter, Senior Account Executive, polished and professional. Nobody here knew that it used to be Grant. Nobody needed to. But as soon as I stepped out of the elevator, I could feel it. That shift in the air, whispers where there used to be greetings, a few glances that didn't bother to hide. My assistant, Claire, was standing by my door, holding a manila folder like it was a live grenade. "Mr. Carter," she said, hesitating, "you might want to see this." It came from compliance. I took the folder, smiled faintly. "Thanks, Claire. You can take your lunch early." Inside the folder was a printed email chain, my resume, my background check, and a note from HR that read, "Discrepancy found in candidate's education and family record requesting clarification." For a moment, the room tilted. I stared at the words, feeling the old, familiar panic rise from somewhere deep inside the same one I'd buried years ago under designer suits and business cards. I'd lied, of course. I'd erased my father from my story. Said he was a civil engineer, passed away in an accident when I was a teenager. Told people I grew up near Lake Geneva, not in a 2-bedroom house behind a lumber yard on the south side of Chicago. The truth had splinters. The lie was smoother. But now the splinters were coming back through the surface. At noon, my boss, Richard Hammond, called me into his office. His walls were lined with photographs, golf tournaments, charity galas, all the people who mattered in Manhattan. He motioned for me to sit. "Daniel," he said, his tone almost kind, but not enough. "There's been some confusion regarding your file." I forced a smile. "Must be a clerical mistake." He slid the papers across the desk. "It says here your father was an engineer, but a background check from the Illinois Department of Revenue lists him as a carpenter. Grant and Son Carpentry, South Chicago." He paused. "And your last name Grant, not Carter." My mouth went dry. I tried to laugh it off. I changed it years ago. For personal reasons." Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Personal reasons are one thing. Misrepresentation is another. You understand the kind of clients we deal with, Daniel. Image matters." There it was, that word again. Image. The thing I'd built my entire life around. And now it was cracking. I tried to hold it together. "Richard, I can explain." He raised a hand. "Not now. The board will review this. For the time being, I need you to step back from the Henderson account." My heart sank. That contract was worth half a year's salary and my reputation. "You're suspending me? I'm protecting the firm." That sentence hit harder than I expected. It was the kind of clean, polished betrayal only corporate America could deliver. I left his office without another word. My reflection in the elevator doors looked like a stranger, tie loosened, eyes hollow, mouth pressed tight enough to draw blood. By the time I got home, Manhattan's lights had begun to smear across the glass of my apartment windows. The place looked expensive, but empty, a museum of a life I'd borrowed. Olivia was at the kitchen counter, scrolling on her phone, but she looked up as soon as she saw my face. "What happened?" "Work stuff," I muttered, tossing my jacket onto the couch. "Daniel." Her tone was steady but sharp. "What kind of work stuff?" I didn't answer. I went to the bar cart and poured myself a drink instead. The first sip burned, but not enough. She crossed her arms. "You're lying again, aren't you?" I froze, glass halfway to my lips. What's that supposed to mean? Olivia walked over to the dining table. There, sitting neatly on the glass top, was a photograph. Old, faded, and painfully familiar. It was my parents' wedding picture, the same one I'd sworn I'd thrown away years ago. "Where did you get that?" My voice cracked sharper than I wanted. "I found it," she said. "And I met him." For a second, the world went silent. My heartbeat filled the room. "You what?" "I met your father, Daniel. Thomas Grant. He's not dead. He's not an engineer. He's a carpenter. And he's a better man than the one standing in front of me." The words cut deeper than I was ready for. I set my drink down too hard. The glass cracked. "You had no right to go there," I snapped. "No right," she repeated, her voice trembling now not from fear, but anger. "I had every right to know who I married. You built our life on a lie, Daniel. You lied about your family, your past hell, even your name." 7. I wanted to shout back, to turn the guilt into rage. But something inside me broke first. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to grow up ashamed. To see people look at your father's hands, those rough, cracked hands, and know they're judging you before you even open your mouth." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "No, Daniel. You're not ashamed of what he was. You're ashamed of who you are." For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, and the slow, inevitable collapse of everything I'd built. I don't remember how long I stood there after Olivia walked out. Maybe a few seconds. Maybe an hour. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the apartment, bouncing off every surface until it felt like the whole place was rejecting me too. The city outside was still alive, horns, sirens, laughter from the street below, but up here, on the 23rd floor, everything felt dead. I sank into the couch, my head in my hands, the silence pressing against me like a punishment. All these years I'd told myself I was different, smarter, stronger, that I had escaped the fate of men like my father, sweating in a workshop, hands cracked, back bent, dignity measured in the smoothness of a plank. But now, sitting there, surrounded by glass and emptiness, I saw how wrong I was. I hadn't escaped him. I'd betrayed him. The lies had started small, one polished sentence at a networking event, one rephrased story at a dinner party. Each time, it got easier to replace truth with comfort. Until one day, even I started believing the version of myself that didn't exist. I poured another drink, but the taste turned bitter halfway through. I set the glass down and stared at the framed photos on the shelf, me and Olivia at company parties, on vacations, standing in front of landmarks where I'd grinned like a man who had it all. The morning I walked into the lawyer's office, the sky over Chicago was gray in that particular way it gets before a late winter storm, the kind of gray that makes the air taste like metal and memory. The building itself was old brick, tucked between a coffee shop and a printing store. Not the kind of place where $15 million usually changes hands. But maybe that was fitting. My family had never been the marble lobby type. The lawyer's name was Michael Dorsey, thin, polite, efficient, the kind of man who spoke in paragraphs. He greeted me with a handshake and a warmth that seemed practiced but genuine. "Mr. Grant," he said, motioning toward a seat. "I'm glad you could come. I have everything ready for your review." I sat down slowly, my knees protesting. The desk between us was neat, papers stacked in precise squares, the air smelling faintly of coffee and lemon polish. Michael slid a few folders toward me. "Per the terms of your late Uncle Edward's will, you are the sole heir. The assets are held in a trust valued at approximately $15 million, primarily in property and investments. The only stipulation, as you know, is that the beneficiary must carry the Grant name with pride." That last word, pride, hung in the air. I nodded. "Then I suppose I qualify." He smiled faintly. "I'd say you more than qualify." We spent the next hour going over documents, titles, transfers, tax details that blurred together after a while. I wasn't used to this kind of language. For most of my life, the only papers I'd signed were invoices and supply orders for the shop. "When it was all done," Michael said, "you understand, of course. You don't have to keep this to yourself. This is a significant inheritance. Most people would make an announcement." I leaned back, considering his words. "Most people haven't been publicly humiliated by their own blood," I said quietly. "I think I'll keep it simple." He nodded. "Would you like to set up a financial advisor?" "No," I said. "I already know what I'm going to do with it." That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the inheritance documents spread out in front of me, like a map I didn't quite know how to read. Beside them was a framed photo of Margaret, her smile frozen in that way only old photographs can manage, soft but certain. "I guess you were right all along, Maggie," I murmured. "Hard work doesn't die with us. It just waits until someone remembers its worth." I spent the next few days in the workshop, though I didn't do much carpentry. Mostly, I thought. I ran my fingers over old tools, the kind my father had used, the kind Daniel had once played with before life told him that hands like mine were the wrong kind to have. By the end of the week, I'd made a decision. The money wasn't mine to hoard. It belonged to something bigger, to the legacy that name carried. So I started a foundation, the Margaret Carter Grant Foundation, named for the woman who had spent her life believing in work, kindness, and quiet dignity. I went to see Father Matthews at the local parish, the same priest who'd married Margaret and me 40 years ago, the same man who'd presided over her funeral. His hair was white now. His hands trembled slightly as he poured us both coffee. "So," he said, smiling gently, "you've decided to do some good with that blessing of yours." "It's not about blessings, Father," I said. "It's about balance. My family lost something, and I want to set it right." He nodded, eyes kind. "You've always carried that weight, Thomas. But remember, redemption isn't only about paying back what's been broken. Sometimes it's about letting others build from it." That line stayed with me long after I left. The following month was a blur of meetings, city permits, non-profit registration, finding a board of trustees. I brought in my old friend Ben, of course. He knew everyone in the community. He joked that he didn't understand half the paperwork, but would hammer a nail or two if it helped. We held the first meeting in the workshop itself. I cleared out the sawdust, polished the old sign Grant & Son Carpentry, and set out a tray of donuts and thermoses of coffee. The people who showed up weren't bankers or politicians. They were neighbors, teachers, retired mechanics, and one young woman from the local trade school who wanted to learn carpentry. I told them about the foundation, how it would fund vocational training for working families, scholarships for kids who wanted to learn a trade, and small business grants for blue-collar startups. It's not charity, I said. It's a handshake across generations. We build with what we have, and we leave it stronger than we found it. The crowd nodded. Some even clapped. Ben winked at me from the back, mouthing, "You did good, Tom." A week later, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune came by. She'd heard about a retired carpenter starting a multi-million-dollar foundation. I agreed to an interview, but only on one condition. She couldn't mention the amount. When she asked why, I told her the truth. Because I don't want people to remember a number. I want them to remember the name. Her story ran 2 days later under the headline, "Local Craftsman Honors Family Legacy with Community Foundation." It was a good piece, honest, humble, not sensationalized. Still, seeing my name in print like that stirred something in me. For years, I'd been the man in the shadows, the quiet father who got mocked at his son's wedding, the widower keeping his grief between the cracks of old wood. Now, for the first time in a long time, the name Grant stood for something again. That night, after the calls and the congratulations, the house went quiet. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the paper folded neatly beside me. Outside, the neighborhood was calm, porch lights flickering, the faint hum of a passing train. I turned to the photo of Margaret on the mantel and whispered, "You'd like this, Maggie. You always did." The rain that night didn't fall. It poured. Sheets of it hammered against the windows, the kind of downpour that makes the city sound like it's drowning in its own noise. The clock on my wall read just past midnight when the phone started to ring. At first, I didn't move. Calls that came at that hour rarely carried good news. I let it ring twice, 3 times, before picking up. "Yeah?" There was silence, the kind thick enough to feel. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Dad." Daniel's tone was low, shaky. I could hear rain on his end, too, maybe the echo of a car idling nearby. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the storm filled the space between us, steady and merciless. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. He took a long breath. "No, not really." I leaned back in my chair, gripping the receiver. "What happened?" He hesitated, then words tumbled out like broken glass. "Olivia left. She took her things and moved out. The firm terminated my contract last week. My account's frozen, my apartment's 2 months behind. He stopped, his breath catching. "Dad, I need $5,000 to keep from getting evicted." I stared at the floor, my chest tightening. The old boards creaked beneath my boots as if they too recognized the weight of what was happening. For years, I'd imagined this call, not the words, maybe, but the tone, the defeated voice of a man who'd finally met the truth he'd spent his life running from. I didn't answer right away. The rain outside filled the silence, steady and relentless. 5,000, I repeated softly. "You used to laugh at that number. You said only men with small dreams talked about money that small." "In 20. "Dad, please," he said, his voice cracking. "I wouldn't ask if—" I cut him off, quietly. "If you weren't desperate—" He didn't respond. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I saw him at 12 knees scraped from falling off his bike, holding back tears because he thought crying made him weak. Back then, I'd told him, there's no shame in falling, only in refusing to stand up again. Now here he was, older, successful once, stripped of everything but pride and fear. "Daniel," I said, my tone calm, almost too calm. "If you're ashamed of our name, son, you should be proud enough to live without it." The silence on the line was sharp. Then came the sound, not quite a sob, more like air catching in his throat. "Dad, I'm not asking for forgiveness," he whispered. I don't know where else to go." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. There was too much history between us, too many things said and unsaid. Too many nights I'd sat by the phone waiting for a call that never came. So I stayed quiet. Finally, he muttered, "Forget it." And the line went dead. The dial tone lingered like a ghost in the room. I sat there for a long time, the rain still coming down hard. My hand trembled slightly as I set the receiver back on its cradle. I looked over at the photograph of Margaret on the mantel, her eyes soft even through the glass. "What would you have done, Maggie?" I asked quietly. "Would you have sent him the money?" Of course she would have. She'd always had the bigger heart between us. But Margaret wasn't here anymore, and I wasn't the man I used to be. I got up, poured myself a small glass of bourbon, and stared out the window. The city lights blurred through the rain, turning into streaks of gold and gray. Somewhere out there, my son was sitting alone, maybe in his car, maybe under some overhang, trying to hold together the pieces of a life built on pride. I took a slow sip and whispered to no one. "Maybe this is what it takes, boy. Maybe you needed to lose it all to remember who you are." The storm raged on. I turned off the lamp and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice, that mix of desperation and shame echoing through the darkness. At some point before dawn, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the sun was pushing pale light through the curtains. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and shining. I shuffled into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the table like I did every morning. The house was quiet, too quiet, until my laptop pinged with a new message. It was from Olivia. The subject line simply read, "About Daniel." I hesitated before opening it. The body of the email was short, just a few sentences. "Mr. Grant, I know last night must have been hard. Daniel is not the same man I married, and that's a good thing. He's finally seeing what he's done, who he's hurt. He told me he called you. He was crying when he said it. Please don't give up on him. I think he's ready to listen now." I read the message twice, then a third time, the words settling like dust. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger. Only something quieter, deeper, a kind of ache that sits somewhere between pride and forgiveness. I turned to the window again. The street outside glistened under morning light. Maybe it was time to give the boy one more chance. The email from Olivia sat open on my screen long after I'd finished reading it. The cursor blinked at the bottom as if waiting for me to type something, anything. But my hands stayed still on the table, wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the morning had turned from silver to gold. Sunlight streamed across the kitchen floor, landing on the small wooden cross that hung above the window. I hadn't looked at that cross in a long time. It used to mean something different when Margaret was alive. Now, it felt more like a reminder of faith, of mercy, of the things we owe each other even after they're broken. I finally closed the laptop and sat there for a while, listening to the ticking clock. Then, without really thinking about it, I got up and went out to the workshop. The air smelled of cedar and varnish. The light filtering through the dusty window made everything look softer, almost sacred. I ran my hand along one of the benches, feeling the nicks and grooves left from decades of work. My hands had built tables, doors, cribs, things that had outlasted my patience, my pride, even my marriage. I thought of Daniel as a boy again, standing right there by that same bench, eyes wide with curiosity, sawdust in his hair. He'd once carved his initials into a scrap of oak and grinned like it was the proudest thing he'd ever done. I still kept that piece of wood in a drawer somewhere. And now that same boy, my son, was out there, lost and hollow, choking on the lies he'd built around his own name. I never thought I'd see the Grant name written in gold again. But there it was, the Margaret Carter Grant Foundation Annual Gala, embossed on a banner that stretched across the grand ballroom of the Lakeshore Hotel in downtown Chicago. The letters shimmered beneath the chandelier light like they were carved out of something sacred, not money, but redemption. The air smelled of polished wood and fresh lilies. Guests in formal wear moved in slow, graceful rhythms. City officials, church members, reporters, neighbors, even a few of the young apprentices from the community workshop. Their laughter, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of a jazz quartet, it all blended into a kind of music I hadn't heard in years. I stood at the back of the hall for a moment, letting it all sink in. The last time I'd been in a room filled with so much light, I'd left humiliated. That night, Daniel had lifted a glass and shattered something inside me. Tonight, the same light fell across a banner carrying our name, the one he had once spat out like a curse. When I walked toward the stage, I caught sight of him. Daniel stood by the entrance, nervously adjusting his tie. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding behind anyone's name. His badge read, Daniel Grant Carter, the two halves of his life finally stitched together. He looked older, thinner, but more human than I'd ever seen him. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod, hesitant, almost boyish, and I felt something in my chest loosen. A soft voice pulled me back. "Mr. Grant, they're ready for you." The event coordinator gestured toward the podium. The microphone gleamed beneath the lights. I climbed the few steps slowly, my heart beating in quiet rhythm with the applause that rippled through the room. "Good evening," I began, the microphone picking up the grain in my voice. "Thank you all for being here. This night isn't just about charity. It's about memory." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough. My late wife Margaret used to say that a man's legacy isn't written in stone or signed in ink. It's carved in how he treats people, one act of kindness, one honest day's work at a time. "Hi, Stell." I looked around the room at the faces that had known me as the old carpenter down the street, at the young workers who now stood a little taller because someone believed in them. "This foundation exists," I said, "because a Grant never forgets where he comes from." A hush spread across the hall. Even the jazz musicians had stopped mid-note. I took a deep breath, then continued. "Many years ago my family name was small, too small for some to wear proudly. But life has a way of humbling the proud and honoring the steadfast." I let my gaze drift toward Daniel. "Tonight, I want to share a truth that even I didn't expect." There was a rustle among the guests, cameras lifting, whispers rising. "I am the sole heir to my Uncle Edward Grant's estate," I said clearly. "A man who believed that our name meant something worth standing for. He left behind $15 million and one condition, that whoever carried his name did so with pride and integrity." Murmurs filled the room. I saw Daniel freeze, his eyes widening as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "That inheritance," I went on, "is what built this foundation. Every dollar of it has been turned into scholarships, apprenticeships, and opportunities for working families, the kind of people my wife and I once were. Because honor," I said, my voice firm now, "isn't in what you own, but in what you give." For a moment, there was silence so thick you could feel the heartbeat of the room. Then applause, a wave of it, long, rising, unstoppable. I stepped back slightly, overwhelmed. Lights flashed, people stood, and for a second, all I could see were the blurred outlines of faces and hands clapping. And through the blur, I saw Daniel. He wasn't clapping, he was crying. Not the quiet kind of tears that people hide, but the full, unguarded kind that tear through pride and land right where truth lives. He began walking toward me, shoulders shaking. The crowd made way without being asked. When he reached the stage, he stopped, breathing hard, eyes red. "I didn't know," he whispered, voice breaking. "All this time, I thought, you were just trying to shame me." I shook my head slowly. "No, son. I just wanted you to see that our name never needed to change." "You did." Something broke inside him then. He stepped forward and threw his arms around me. For a heartbeat, I hesitated. Old habits die hard, but then my arms found him too. The applause swelled again, louder this time, carrying us both in its warmth. The lights caught on the gold lettering above us. The Grant Foundation. And for the first time, it felt like the name finally belonged to both of us. The cameras clicked, the band began to play again, and someone in the crowd shouted, "To the Grants!" Laughter followed, bright and free. I looked at Daniel, my son, and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Welcome home." He nodded, still trembling, and said, "It's good to be home, Dad." The night blurred after that, speeches, photographs, handshakes, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that, under the golden light of that hall, two men who had once turned their backs on each other finally stood side by side. When the event ended, I found him outside by the fountain, jacket slung over his shoulder, staring at the water. "You okay?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Better than I deserve." "You've earned this moment," I said. "Don't run from it." He turned to me, his eyes softer than I'd seen in decades. "I'm done running, Dad. Farewell." The city lights shimmered on the lake beyond us, and for once, silence between us felt whole, not empty. It's been a year since that night, a year since the applause, the gold lights, and the sound of my son's voice breaking on the word Dad. Now, the mornings in Chicago are quieter. The world feels slower here, less about proving and more about living. I wake up to the smell of sawdust again, to the low hum of machines and the tap of chisels. The foundation office is just a few blocks away, but most days I find myself back here in the workshop that started it all. We brought back the old sign, Grant and Son Carpentry. For a long time, that little wooden plaque had gathered dust in the shed, its paint chipped, its letters faded. Daniel was the one who insisted we hang it again. "It belongs up there," he said, "just like it used to." Now it hangs above the door, proud and steady. Inside, things have changed too. Where once there was only me and the quiet echo of memory, now there are apprentices, a handful of young men and women from the south side, learning to build, to sand, to measure twice and cut once. The sound of laughter mixes with the rasp of saws. It feels alive. Daniel runs the teaching program most days. Watching him explain how to align a frame, or how to let the wood speak before cutting, still surprises me. His tone carries that blend of humility and confidence that comes only after you've lost everything and found something truer in the ruins. One of the boys once asked him, "Mr. Grant, were you always a carpenter?" Daniel had paused, smiled, and said, "No, but I should have been." I remember turning away then, pretending to check a drawer, because something in my chest had tightened that strange mixture of pride and regret that only a parent can understand. Later that afternoon, as we were closing up, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Olivia. Her hair was shorter now, her smile quieter but real. She'd come back to Chicago a few months after the gala, and little by little, she and Daniel found their way back to each other. Not through grand gestures, just small, steady acts, helping with the foundation, volunteering at the church, sharing coffee after long days. When Daniel asked her to remarry him, they kept it simple, a small ceremony at Street Luke's, with only a few friends, and me standing there beside them. I remember thinking that Margaret would have loved it, the simplicity, the sincerity, and now, as I sit by the window, I can hear the sound of a baby laughing from outside their son, little Edward Grant Carter, named after the man who had unknowingly stitched our family back together. The boy's laughter bounces across the yard, followed by Daniel's voice calling, "Steady there, buddy. Watch your fingers." I walk to the doorway and lean against the frame. Daniel is kneeling beside a small workbench he built just for the boy. Edward's tiny hands clutch a piece of sandpaper, clumsy but determined. The sunlight falls across both their faces, one lined with years, one new and unspoiled. I don't say anything. I just stand there, feeling the warmth fill the space where bitterness used to live. When Daniel finally looks up, he grins. "He's got your patience, you know. Or maybe your stubbornness," I reply. He laughs. "Guess that makes us even." We share a smile, quiet, content, wordless. The kind of smile that says everything that ever needed to be said. As evening settles, Olivia calls them in for dinner. The smell of roasted chicken drifts through the open door, and the sound of Edward's giggles trails behind them as they head inside. I stay for a moment longer, alone with the fading light. The sky turns amber, and the workshop glows like something holy. I take a seat on the old wooden bench outside the same one Margaret used to sit on when she'd bring me lemonade in the summer. The air is cool, still carrying a faint sweetness of pine. I look toward the sign above the door. Grant and Son. The letters are catching the last rays of the sun, glowing like gold. I think of the years, the fights, the silence, the redemption that took its time arriving, and I whisper, not to anyone in particular, but to the evening itself. The Grant name doesn't just live on. It's finally understood. For the first time in a long life, I feel peace, not the fragile kind that hides behind quiet, but the kind that stands tall, weathered, earned. Inside, I can hear laughter, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandson, and somewhere in that laughter, I swear I can hear Margaret too. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.